Yeah, welcome to the fourth panel in the Diversity in Development series. My name is Syeda Masood, and I am an alum of the MPA ID program. I graduated in 2008. Currently, I'm a PhD candidate at Brown University doing a PhD in sociology. This series is a result of a collaboration between the Growth Lab, the Center for International Development, the MPA ID program, and MPA ID alumni community through Elevate, which is a group of alumni seeking to support the program in thinking more seriously about racism and colonialism in its curriculum. This collaboration is a testament to the interest in having a platform to talk about questions of diversity, inclusion, and development in our community of academics, practitioners, and policymakers. The broad goal is to have thoughtful and informed discussions about racism and its linkages with colonialism in the field of development from academic and practitioner perspectives, as well as from lived experiences. I also want to acknowledge that Harvard University has pledged $100 million this week to redress its ties with slavery. As the title of the session indicates, today's talk is about the connections between the history of colonialism in the world and the biases prevalent in the international development sector and the practice of development more generally. Both of our guests today will discuss what their vision of decolonizing development looks like and what the road ahead might entail. In previous sessions, we asked fundamental questions about diversity and development and heard from several MPID alums about their personal experiences at the intersection of that. Today, we go further and discuss how historical forces shape and influence the practice of development, quote unquote, as we know it today. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to welcome our panelists today. Zophia Edwards is an associate professor at Providence College, Rhode Island. Her research examines the impacts of colonialism and multiracial labor movements on state formation and human development in the global South. Her work is particularly focused on the Caribbean. She holds a PhD from Boston University and is currently writing a book with NYU Press, I found out recently, on modernity as seen from the Haitian Revolution, which I'm very excited about. Olivia Rutazibwa is currently an assistant professor in human rights and politics in the Department of Sociology at London School of Economics. She is an international relations scholar. Her research and teaching focuses on ways to decolonize international solidarity, including development. She is also associate editor of International Feminist Journal of Politics and recently joined the editorial board of International Politics Review. I want to welcome Professor Edwards and Professor Rutazibwa, while also acknowledging that this is an all-female person of color panel. The panelists will speak for 10 minutes each, and then we will have a 15-minute Q&A. 15-minute Q&A between the three of us, and then I will open it to Q&A from the audiences. Please feel free to write any of your comments and questions in the Q&A. I will read out your name and question to the panelists. I want to especially also thank Tim, Nikita, and Chuck at the Growth Lab for their help with organizing this panel in an excellent way. So I want to first ask Zophia to start her discussion for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Syeda. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm really excited for the conversation, and I'm really happy to be on this panel with Professor Rutazibwa because I've been wanting to chat with you for a long time. So I'm very excited for this panel today. So I'll start with sort of this book that I want to kind of draw attention to that has been marginalized in development studies. This year is the 50th anniversary of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And about a month ago, the Walter Rodney Foundation hosted a celebration for the anniversary of this seminal text. Walter Rodney was a Guyanese-born historian, a committed Pan-Africanist and Marxist in the Caribbean radical tradition. And he first published this book in 1972, just before his 30th birthday. While this work is underappreciated in mainstream development studies, the text is globally recognized as a central work on African political economy and development. And in this book, Rodney does a lot of things. He extends a meticulous and rigorous Marxist analysis to African economic and social conditions, and he exposes how underdevelopment was produced, actively generated by centuries of systematic European plunder and the enslavement and labor superexploitation of African peoples. So he is different from many historians and social scientists at the time who places the blame of African development not on African people, but rather on the European-driven global capitalist imperialist system as a whole. But the book is not just another argument within sort of what we think of as the dependency school of thought developed by Andre Gunda Frank and Cardoso and Fileto, for example, because he goes beyond them. Some of his noteworthy interventions include completely upending the dominant Eurocentric imperialist narratives about the economic and social conditions in Africa and challenging hegemonic conceptualizations of development. So in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney argues, if underdevelopment were related to anything other than comparing economies, then the most underdeveloped country in the world would be the USA, which practices external oppression on a massive scale, while internally there is a blend of exploitation, brutality, and psychiatric disorder. So here, Rodney really flips the concept of development on its head. Of course, he sees basic indicators like food requirements, life expectancy, social services, public health and education as all important aspects of human flourishing. But he argues that the hegemonic conceptualization of development is specifically capitalist development, the accumulation of wealth through capitalist social relations, and that an integral part of capitalist development is racism and colonial domination. In fact, racial and colonial oppression enabled capitalist development and its ongoing operation as an economic system. European planters and miners enslaved Africans in order to exploit their labor power and generate wealth. Then, having become utterly dependent on African labor and African women's reproductive labor, I will also add, we should not forget this, Europeans in their countries and abroad found it necessary to rationalize and justify that exploitation. So they used and proliferated erroneous and unscientific racist ideas. I'll quote him again where he says, racism, violence, and brutality were the concomitants of the capitalist system when it extended itself abroad in the early centuries of international trade. So some questions I want to introduce for us in this conversation today is what happens when we conceptualize development as racial and colonial oppression? What does this do to the study of development? How does this invert our understanding of which countries are quote unquote advanced and which are not? And then by extension, how would we measure racism, violence, and dispossession in contemporary terms as well? And I would say that we do have dependency on both systems theory. These scholars are very strong in terms of operationalizing the colonial and neocolonial architectures of extraction and exploitation. So these scholars talk about, for instance, the adverse impacts of foreign direct investment, foreign aid, foreign loans, coercive international financial institutions, and so on the autonomy and self-determination and development of countries in peripheralized regions of the world. But I would say rarely do we see them articulating explicitly racial oppression historically or contemporarily as part of their analyses of uneven development. And then if we look at the branch of research most recently that looks at the relationship between colonialism and development, in some of the most cited papers in these contemporary studies, they operationalize colonial domination or colonial rule, as they call it, as the number of Europeans who settled in a colony, or the number of European descended people in a colony, the number of police officers, the number of court cases that were presided over by colonial officials, the size of the colonial state, the length of colonial rule, these kinds of measures. And I'm thinking of studies like Acemoglu and Robinson's work, Mahoney, Lang, these scholars. And these studies invariably find that the greater the European presence in a colony, but particularly with Acemoglu's study, the more favorable the development outcome. These studies talk about the institutions that these Europeans built in these colonies, institutions of private property rights, law and order, etc., as positive attributes positive attributes of colonial rule, in the sense that this was the necessary administrative infrastructure that led to positive long-run development. But virtually none of these studies conceptualize racial domination as linked to colonial domination. But in Rodney's views, these indicators are precisely the indicators of the architecture of colonial violence against people who are racialized as non-whites for the purposes of legitimating extraction and superexploitation. And racism and colonialism are intimately intertwined. So Rodney, for instance, says, and I quote, "It was economics that determined that Europe should invest in Africa and control the continent's raw materials and labor. It was racism which confirmed the decision that the form of control should be direct colonial rule." So what if we took a critical stance on colonialism and assessed racialized colonial violence, as opposed to this terminology of colonial rule, as a driver of capitalist development in the core? How would we conduct our research differently? Conceptualizing development as racial violence and plunder might lead us to want to, for instance, measure slavery and its impacts upon long-term development, divergent core periphery development, in the spirit of the great theory, another great theorist, Eric Williams. We might look at the rate of murder of colonized populations, rapes, genocides that were part and parcel of capital accumulation. And then our interpretation of these studies will also have to be quite different, radically different, right? Because if we go with Rodney's epistemological intervention, we would view states that build wealth through the organization and exercise of racial violence upon people that they racialize as inferior, both within their borders and around the world as underdeveloped. And then I think we would also have to rethink what we should be aspiring to, what kind of world we want to live in. Rodney is one of the many Black anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperial, anti-racist thinkers who understand and theorize this intertwined relationship between capitalism, racism, imperialism, exploitation, and dispossession. Capitalist social relations are built on racialized exploitation and oppression. And even Du Bois shares this revelation in 1940, where he says, had it not been for the race problem early thrust upon me and enveloping me, I should have probably been an unquestioning worshiper at the shrine of the social order and economic development into which I was born. But just that part of that order, which seemed to most of my fellows nearest perfect, seemed to be most inequitable and wrong. So these scholar activists, these revolutionary thinkers, they envisioned a new world constructed to uphold racial and class equality and human dignity. Fanon, for example, argues that we must strive for a world that is free of the differentiations, the stratification, the bloodthirsty tensions fed by classes, racial hatreds, slavery, exploitation, and above all, the bloodless genocide, which consisted in the setting aside of 15,000 millions of men. Rodney gives us the tools for thinking about how we might conceptualize and study development differently. And I'm not saying in this talk that we should do more quantitative work or less historical work, absolutely not. But I'm saying that these are the dominant studies within development research that we see today. And what Rodney gives us is an epistemological intervention to be able to address these Eurocentric methods of conducting investigations and thinking about and moving towards development differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Zophia. This was really exciting and thought-provoking. Now I would ask Olivia to please start her 10 minutes.
Thank you. This is really exciting. I also really wanted to meet you for a long time. And the comments I want to make, it's going to sound as if we talked together before and I fine-tuned how we're going to talk. So in a way, it comes really well together. I'm so glad also that you spoke of Rodney because it's a person I have been thinking a lot while preparing this presentation. And so I will try to do three things in the 10 minutes I have. And the first one also refers to Rodney. By way of introduction, I like to give a background, but also explicitly ground the practice of grounding where we're speaking from, right? So I'll be specific about where I think I'm speaking from, and obviously that does not necessarily apply to everyone, but I think it's good practice that we don't always see in our quants approaches to development. Secondly, I would like to maybe offer by way of building on what we just heard, three ways to conceptualize what it might mean to invoke the colonial when we try to engage. And again, I'll give not necessarily definitions, but more as instruments to think of what is it that we're thinking about, rather than making claims like this is the only way that we should understand it. And then lastly, I would love to think through what are some of the implications if we were to engage in decolonizing development, if that's at all possible, but even if we try and think about development in anti-racist and anti-colonial terms, so a bit following also on Professor Edwards. So I think in the first sense, if I need to do a backgrounding, I would like to make explicit that I think, or maybe the way that I would engage with it is to differentiate the question of development as something, or decolonizing development, that might look different if you speak from a global northern perspective. And again, it's not necessarily just literally, us as individual positionalities, right? But as the conversation that we're having within the walls of a global northern institutions, and a lot of our universities throughout the world have been quite violently westernized. So I think in academia, but also in practice. So on the one hand, what does it look like to think about development if we're talking from the places that continue to benefit from colonialism in the present? And then I think additionally, and that's also again where we're engaging with people like Rodney or just ourselves, there is maybe something about this conversation that comes to the fore, or the sense of urgency we might have because we also speak from the diaspora, right? So I guess personally, this is what I would like to offer is both, being quite explicit that I am not speaking from the global south. And I know the binary is it might sound artificial, but I think it's just about being I don't know, there is so much in decolonizing discussions today that do not necessarily do that, meaning that we continue from the global north to tell how the global south should decolonize. So I'm trying to make it clear that that's something that, and it'll become clear why I'm trying to make this so explicit. It has to do with reparations, and I've had conversations with my friends and colleagues in Rwanda. They're like, we don't have time for that. Like, we're doing something else. And when we realize that, yeah, we don't all have to have the same conversation at the same time, but we can talk to each other, obviously. On a more personal note, I think if I had to background where I'm speaking from is this fascination with global solidarities in general and how they do reproduce coloniality in the many ways that we've already heard. And for me specifically, it was trying to make sense as a second generation Rwandan of the discrepancy between the discourses around development and aid and assistance and interventions and everything, and the reality in my case, very specifically of the genocide in '94, where you have an international community that just disappears. And I guess it took me a long time to understand that it's not just about making sure that our practices map better onto, or more systematically onto the discourses that, again, the global north has about its own solidarities, but it's actually about denaturalizing those discourses. And again, as Zophia said, there's a lot of deeply hierarchized racist fundaments that continue to be reproduced in that, right? Like this mythology of the West having moral high ground when it comes to human rights, and where all these things have been invented, all of that. And again, I guess if we ask explicitly, we will tell ourselves, no, but we have to nuance it. But a lot of the logics of how international aid is organized has a reproduction of this moral, technical, political, all these high grounds that the moment you just scratch the surface of history, it just implodes, right? So I guess that's where, for me, very specifically, decoloniality or decolonizing comes in. But it also makes maybe that I might be speaking more about development aid in this context than development per se. And again, we'll see what that brings. So secondly, if I have to think of various ways that might be useful for us if we want to think about engaging the colonial. The first one is to try and engage with something to do with time, I guess, but it's also the concept, right? So Zophia mentioned Colonial Rule, which makes it sound, quite technical or whatever. So we don't have to engage with all the other stuff that comes with it. But the other division that we often hear within our discourses is a differentiation that is made in decolonial thought between colonialism as a historical moment, as a formal form of governance. We can think about it as flag planting. You come into a place, declare it yours, plant your flag, and then take over governance. And of that, often the reaction would be like, yeah, no, we're beyond that. That has passed. The successful decolonization processes, apart from the fact that we still have the settler colonial countries of the US, New Zealand, Australia, Palestine, and others. So there's a lot to be said about even that discourse, to think that we've moved beyond the formal colonization of places and peoples. We haven't, right? But let's say that it's also, I guess, not really salient to pretend that the 60s didn't happen. So a lot of successful struggles took place. So the colonialism on the one hand as a historical moment, but then the contribution for me from decolonial thought is the concept of coloniality, where they actually try to say that regardless almost of where it happened, when it happened, whether it's and by whom, it's about trying to point at extreme power inequalities and all the institutions we have in place to perpetuate those, right? And I think those that distinction allows us to, quickly snap out of this idea that it's in the past, what are you on about? We're thinking about the present, especially development has a lot of presentism in it. Another way to make a distinction, to conceptualize the colonial is to point immediately, not at the successful modes of governance, whatever, but the colonial is a system of destruction. It just is. It's been always part of deeply destructive forces, destruction and extraction. And within destruction, distinctions that are made from decolonial thinkers is one that points at the destruction of bodies, genocide. So genocide not necessarily as a legal concept, but as, disposability of certain peoples. But the destruction also of ways of thinking, philosophies, languages, whatever. And so they call that epistemicide, and how that also goes hand in hand with the systematic destructions of life environments, ecocide. And so if we take these three together, then again, we won't waste time in, was there also something positive about colonialism? We literally don't have time, I think, to have that. And lastly, I think it's important, especially within development cooperation thinking, that the colonial always has been an imposition as well, an imposition of one way of being, understanding, knowing, doing, that is then declared as a universal one to go for, and development obviously also is very, very much at the center of that. So that invites us to actually think about the extent to which, if we want to decolonize anything, it's not just about what can we do more or differently, but also what do we have to stop doing. And so in the 1 minute that I have left, about the implications, but I'm sure that a lot will come in the Q&A, maybe following on the third point I made about the colonial as an imposition, I think it invites us to think about abolition and not just reform of development or whatever. But there is something about, especially development aid, especially if we call it aid after the whole colonial thing, that it just becomes quite obscene to call it aid. You cannot help someone after you've rubbed them blind, because then you would have to turn around and speak about repair and reparations, which would entail a deep dislocation of power. The other one would be to reinscribe development, and then more development in terms of how Walter Rodney thought of it, because, and I'm paraphrasing, but for him, development has something to do with people's ability to adapt themselves to their life environments in the best of ways. That can be done in many different ways, right? So that's also one of the things that I take from his. So it would involve, I think, reinscribing the project of development at the service of life, which is not always the case for all the reasons that have been summed up, but also maybe engaging some pluriversality, where this homogenizing processes, where it's okay from Washington to think for the rest of the world how they should develop, is quite problematic. And also following on what Zophia was saying, it also requires us to re-engage with the question of capitalism, because capitalism as a force of death and destruction is quite important. And then I think lastly, to come back to the time frame, it also invites us to really actively fight against colonial amnesia, pretending that stuff didn't happen, and also white innocence. And white here is a wider category than phenotype, but there is such a strong desire for innocence that is reproduced through development aid that I don't think we can sustain in the long run. So yeah, 11 minutes. I'm going to stop here, but I'm very much looking forward to the questions that might come our way. Thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you both for these thought-provoking starting comments. And now, what I was thinking, actually, what I tried to do is to have an academic who thinks from a positivist perspective on these questions, but somehow that couldn't happen in the time that we were able to be here. So I am actually wearing my hat as a development practitioner from, pre-PhD days, and asking some questions from both of you guys who are like working in a paradigm which is actually quite different from how development was taught to me, at least. And many of my very well-meaning and lovely friends still work in the development sector, so they also asked me some of these questions when I wanted to have similar discussions with them. So first of all, I'm starting the 15-minute clock now. So my first question is, like, if a well-meaning person works in, for example, the World Bank, and the minister of an African nation, for example, Sierra Leone, for example, asks him, not just asks him, but begs him for money, for education, for his country, why what he's doing is bad? Isn't what he's doing is actually something very good? Because apparently, like the minister who represents an African country wants money pretty badly. What are your thoughts about it?
So, yeah, the practical questions, they're always the most challenging one. Again, I think, and it's not a cop-out, but I want to say it and then move on from that. But I think it's quite important that we would be more specific on who's answering this question, because there is not, but so if I had then to answer it, first of all, I would invite that minister of Sierra Leone to refrain from begging, but he could formulate it as reparations. I mean, and again, that's something that cannot be looked at as an individual question or whatever, right? But there is something to be said that if the money that is being requested is money that you ask back, or whether it's money that it depends on the goodwill of the person on the other side of the table. I'll make it more concrete. I think, and I'll give the example of Rwanda because I know it best. And after the genocide, they realized, I guess, that they can't really count on the international community on the one hand, but on the other hand, also, they felt that there was no reason not to take the international community's money for their rebuilding, right? So it's a very pragmatic approach to it. And what they did at some point was to say, listen, we have so many donors, you guys are all over the place, and even though we have like the Paris Agreement and all these different, aid efficiency rules, it doesn't, So building on that, on those agreements, they said, we will reshuffle it. And I don't remember the details, but let's say that Belgium for the longest time was giving a lot of money in terms of small agricultural projects, and maybe the World Bank was giving money for healthcare in the country. They said, we want to streamline it so everybody can stay around the table, but Belgium from now on, you guys will invest in healthcare and we'll take care of our own organizing of agriculture. And World Bank, you guys can give bigger sums for more general projects. Again, within the country, there's probably a lot of also ideological differences that people might have. But what is important, I think, in this example is that it's not outsiders that will distribute the money or decide how it's going to go, right? And so for a lot of the people in the Rwanda government, for them, it was more like it's literally not out of their business. They have a duty to give us money, and then we'll sort it out. And it had a big backlash. A lot of at the very short term, a lot of these small farmers that were building their businesses with Belgian project money, they saw their life change, right? Like in a negative way, maybe in the short term. And also a lot of Belgian NGOs started being like really upset because a lot of the money goes through them from the Belgian government to run it. So basically this whole reshuffling did not make that many people happy in the short term. But that would be my answer to that. It's about, we have to dislocate the power, and part of the power is agenda setting. But it does not mean that the duty to at least redistribute some of the money that we keep on stealing from the global north, that does not dissipate when we say repair, or when we say stop doing this, or when we say abolition, right? And so that's where the historical and the present, I think, really, really comes together. It also explains why it doesn't really often happen. And that's why I think it's more important to think about development through abolition and trying to reform it, because we've reformed it a billion times. It's not that people within development sector have not thought of reform, right? Very long answer, I'm so sorry, but yeah, that's that would be my first reaction.
Oh, fantastic. What are your thoughts, Zophia, on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that 100%. I mean, I think that there is the practical element to this. And of course, we have, I'm thinking specifically of the Caribbean Commission right now that is trying to push for reparations, and that, reparations for slavery and genocide and dispossession. And I think it is really important. One piece of this that's really important is exactly that question of how that reparations then gets distributed, if they get reparations, how it will be distributed and who will control that process, and what is the vision. So for instance, there are different articulations of sort of what what do you do with reparations? The American descendants of slaves group has a different articulation from the Caribbean community. So how that gets distributed is a very important question. And where are the people, the masses' voices in that? And then the second piece of this is, I think oftentimes this gets seen as an either or, either you ask for reparations or you maintain the same situation that you have now. And I think that, there is there's nothing precluding. I don't think it precludes still organizing towards radical change and radical transformation. So in that sense, I don't see those things as being in conflict. I do see the problem with begging, right? Because that's incredibly problematic. But in terms of seeking justice through reparations and through transformation, I think those are still sort of consistent with radically changing things. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. My other question was about the field of development economics, which is quite a strong field in agenda setting field in development studies. And broadly speaking, development economics teaches people how countries of the global South can somehow become countries as rich as countries of the global North, and what are the different things that they can do. Maybe they have quote unquote weak institutions or governance, or maybe they don't have enough industrialization. But my question is did Europe and its settler colonies develop because they did something particular, and whether it can be replicated by countries of the global South?
Well, I'll answer briefly. And I think that, this is again why history is so important, and which is why I wanted to make the point that I'm not advocating for sort of more number crunching, because history is so important. And I think this is what's severely missing from sort of the development economics fields. And, a lot of much of development studies in general it's so ahistorical that we don't, you cannot recommend in 2022 a path that, to follow some sort of Western path, when so many of the things that European countries did to accumulate that wealth are just no longer legitimate in the eyes of, for people who have been racialized and colonized, it was never legitimate. But they now see it as white people also somewhat, some of them see it also as illegitimate. And so it's not the same world historical context. And so I find that whole thing, the whole sort of prescribing a model based on a completely different historical context to be incredibly problematic in that sense. And then secondly, again, coming back to Walter Rodney's sort of definition of development, is that even what we want to look like, right? Maybe we don't want rampant poverty caused by inequality and capitalism. So I think that, these recommendations, these sort of prescriptions are really coming from an imperial lens and an imperial position, and is perpetuating the same problems that, put us here in the first place.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm an economist by any shape or form, but I think what I meant with we need to be more explicit in reckoning with capitalist system that it's presented to most of us, again, if you study in a westernized university, it's like just really difficult also to come up with an alternative, because then people say, oh, but communism, and that didn't work either, right? And that's the end of the imagination. So I'm not even going to go there, but I think what, again, engaging the colonial shows us is that we have to stop fragmentizing the fragmentation of world history, right? And so, again, how they do it in the literature doesn't really matter, but there is this, Anibal Quijano, I think, started doing it, where we never speak about modernity in isolation. It's always modernity / coloniality. And I think that's quite helpful also for development economics or economic studies in general. And maybe we should stop teaching development economics separately, as if we have to study poverty on the one hand, completely detached from how we study or teach wealth. And so once you do that, then it just becomes really difficult to advocate for capitalism as a superior model, because it's literally one that advocates for wealth accumulation, which, if it were successful, maybe we're not against it. But most of it has been done by not paying for whatever labor that came with it, so it's such a faulty system that by definition, it will never. So the mythology about capitalism is that it potentially creates the most wealth for the most amount of people is simply a lie. I don't even have to be an economist for that. It's the other way around. It's really the concentration of wealth in really small hands, in big hands of a small group of people. And I guess there is a special issue that came out. I can look it up later, and I'm very bad at remembering names, but that's one example that really helped me out understanding it. I think one of the starting stories in many economics handbooks of macroeconomics introduction is this whole story of Robinson Crusoe on his island. And, this individual that, with his own bare hands, whatever managed to do. And this whole idea of the rational man making rational choices. But then you have this other character of Friday, who basically probably did all the work. And you write them out, both of the mythology, but also very much on how you teach rational choice within economic models, whatever. So focusing on the colonial just produces better science. So it's not even about just social justice or whatever. It's like you cut out two-thirds of the story, and then you try to reproduce whatever mythological version of it. And then after 60 years, you wonder, why is it not working? So I don't know. That would be, again, my short answer to that. But it's an important question, especially for those disciplines that look as if we can just teach them in positivist, straightforward ways with its own laws and whatever. I would say history, but also maybe we have to introduce much more politics as well within that. And I don't mean party politics, but maybe ideological choices, and explore other options. And they do exist. And that's why I mentioned the pluriversal, but we have systematically written them out of our handbooks.
Yeah, actually, I remember I did my undergraduate in Pakistan, and I remember we studied economics. The book was actually written by an American, and in the first few pages, it talked about how economics is not a normative discipline, that it's a positive discipline. So these questions of what is right and what is wrong, I actually found it, as a student of economics, I found those questions quite stupid questions to ask, even from my professors. And actually, it was quite eye-opening that in the other discipline that I am in now, sociology, like there are consideration of ethics, and it's not a stupid question to ask if something is good or bad, or like hurts people or something like that. Let's open the panel to, we have 15 minutes left to the Q&A. And I will first ask the question that Orlando Coronado Fernandez asked. He said, "Greetings, everyone. Thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask about the role of colonial institutions, which is the government left behind from colonialism in development."
Maybe more than Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. So I think on the one hand, we can think of it not necessarily as just very particular institutions that are by definition colonial. What might be most colonial about them is the fact that we have ended up with a state structure or systems of governance that are presented as the only way to organize your life or to organize power or to organize. So when in development, we promote liberal market democracy, right? And we don't even call it that. We just call it, democratization or whatever. And it, again, is presented as this neutral, whatever things. I would say that is the problem. The other problem is that it's also systems of governance that often have very little to do with the people concerned. And with that, I'm not saying that people today in the global south do not desire democracy, they always have. But again, that very particular type of it has grown out from a particular situatedness in, let's say, Western development of their own states, which were never national states, they were always empires to begin with. So that's already but there is at least a connection between governance and those that govern and the peoples. And so that was copy pasted onto situations where if you look at the formalistic things of doing elections or whatever, but the whole global system makes it as such that even politicians with the best of intentions in many places in the global south, they're first and foremost accountable to outsiders. And there's no amount of elections that will change that. So I think that those are really important things to think about, because when we, again, also many students, like we're interested in Africa, whatever, oh, we're going to study corruption. And then the corruption is completely historically approached, as in for some magical reasons, people in Africa are more corrupt than somewhere else. So apart from being deeply racist as a reflection, often, again, we don't study it and we place it in the present. And then very technically, we're going to train people to be less corrupt, whatever. And I guess lastly, importantly, is to understand that both the economies and the political organization set in motion during colonial times was always for the benefit of the outside. It was never for at the service of life of the people concerned. And I think the post-colonial moment has not been able to transform those institutions into something that that would reverse that, because even the creation of these countries was never about the people. So yeah, I just spoke about the political institutions, but that would be my.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this reminds me of, I've been rereading Fanon's chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness in Wretched of the Earth. And I think, it still rings so true today that these institutions have been, they basically serve foreign interests. And they have been set up and designed that way. And so when we talk about decolonizing the state, what does that really mean when the people who occupy the positions of power within the now independent state are still oriented towards the metropole, still oriented towards capital accumulation themselves and for foreign investors? I think, this kind of speaks to sort of just the inherent weaknesses of being able to create something different. However, I think it's obviously not impossible, because mass movements can push those states to alter the organization of those states. And I think in this particular historical moment, it's so necessary now, it's so urgent, because we're seeing very, very clearly how neoliberalism has just exacerbated so many of these problems that the newly independent states just were not set up to deal with. And when I say the problems, I mean for the people, for working people. And so these institutions, to just go back to what Olivia was saying, we can't really reform them We can't really reform them. We just have to have something new. Yeah.
Thank you both. Sophie Gardner asks, what three scholars broadly defined would you recommend reading to learn more about neocolonialism today?
Well, I will just say that the ones who I just, Frantz Fanon, I think is timeless. He should definitely be read. Kwame Nkrumah, equally timeless, and continues to, you continue to see the operation of those mechanisms that they lay out so clearly in their work on neocolonialism.
Yeah, as I said, I'm really bad with names. If I'm thinking of something contemporary, and that's maybe specifically already in the state building literature, a book of a colleague of mine called Decolonizing Interventions by Meera Sabaratnam really goes back to some of this more fundamental literatures, obviously, but really applies it to the case of Mozambique. And, it's really, really amazing and very practical, useful way also of thinking. So she did field work and just asked people like, yeah, how did you feel this whole, and there's a lot of neocolonialism that shines through that. Another one, and that's maybe not a name, but I would actually want to draw maybe people's attention to conversations that are ongoing in West Africa around the franc CFA, so the currency there, which is still pegged to the euro through the French banks. And that's a very concrete, tangible way for us to think about, and I'll put it in the chat, to think about this neocolonialism we're talking about is not just in people's minds, because there is still colonization of the minds, obviously, that continues, but it's also very much in, I think they lowered it a little bit, but at least 60 or 70% of the reserves of the countries that are part of are in French banks, right? So when people say that France would not be anything without its colonies, it's very much in the present. So that would be something else I'm thinking about. And I think, not seen as a scholar often, but the late president of Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara, there's a lot of his speeches are around. He had such a really sharp understanding of imperialism and neocolonialism. He was obviously assassinated. So there specifically, for instance, he has one of this thing that he said, like, don't go and look further. If you want to understand what imperialism is or neocolonialism is, just look in your bowl of rice. That's where it's located, right? So again, connecting very much the production of food, the control over it, had a lot to say about development aid, but also very much about dependency that he wanted to break. So that would be another person I would point you towards. But yeah, after this call, I'll be like, oh no, I should have said this. I'm really bad with names, but those are the things. And obviously everything Zophia said, I would, 100%. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Olivia, can you, if you have a chance, write the name of the president of Burkina Faso in the chat, because I did not get that. Thank you. Oh, great. I would also say Anibal Quijano is important to understand coloniality, because how we think of colonialism as something in the past, and how it has nothing to do with the present is something that he talks about quite well. Okay. So Anindita Adhikari asks, how should we view the role of private consultancies, example, McKinsey, Deloitte, KPMG et al., that embed themselves in government departments in many post-colonial countries where they co-create new forms of exclusion, which is not imposition, while doing development within a larger framework of racialized colonialism?
I mean, I would include them in my call to for abolition. As in, I see them as part and parcel of those. The institutions of international cooperation or aid are multi-layered, right? And they're different. So it's not just state to state, whatever. So for me, they're just one of those actors there. The thing is that they're very, they're most explicitly linked to the to the capitalist accumulation logic or the neoliberal understanding of what development should look like, but also how that translates politically. So I would say that it's really important to study them in detail. I mean, I wouldn't have the skills, but so when I say abolition, it doesn't necessarily mean let's dismiss and pretend it doesn't exist. But as a question, I think it's quite important for us to unpack what is this beast that is international cooperation, right, or the global system or whatever. And they're very powerful actors within that. And it might also help to historicize this, right? Because when, we did the flag planting, and I say we, and it's really messing with my mind when I say so, but, again, like how I started, but it was not just armies that went, it was not just the priests, it was not just the teachers, it was the engineers, it was like, so all these different actors have always been around and they've always been part of the same story. The problem is that the missionaries were the benevolent face of the colonial enterprise, right? And I think, again, it helps to because it's so clear that the missionaries messed up, right? And in the present, we have no problem, shooting on them. It's just really important to understand that the same logics are reproduced, but they have very different faces, and those actors are part of that, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is also a related, interesting question to ask of these companies is sort of how, why do these governments call upon them, right? Why do they bring them in? And what are the whole processes there? Because, this question of whether or not it's an imposition, I think, is an interesting one. Because it brings up sort of what do we mean by coercion and how does coercion actually operate on the ground? And I think that's a really important question when it comes to these companies that seemingly act as if, they aren't being coercive, but then what does it mean to get a bad rating from McKinsey, right? And what does that mean for those economies? So, yeah, I would also put that into sort of what would need to be considered as part of the doing development work.
Yeah, thank you. So we are almost out of time. But let's squeeze in one more question. An anonymous attendee asks, in your opinion, what kind of research can students do to contribute with the dialogue and efforts of decolonizing development?
This is a big question. I feel like this is a big question because the field is so vast and what people study can be a lot of different things. But I think what we can really bring together as sort of important themes in the study of whatever field it is we're in or whatever research we're doing is sort of these larger questions of, again, re-centering colonialism and coloniality in any study, because it's so central to modernity and we really cannot divorce our understandings of the contemporary period with, from that violence and those structures. And so I would say that's one thing. Another thing too is to think about the elevation of the voices of the people, working people, the laboring people who are often marginalized in the work that sort of people who are doing work on development even forget, like, those people. And so I think that's another important element in any kind of topic that we're studying, is to really think about, well, what do the people want? And what are their visions and what are their articulations for the kind of world that they want to live in? And so I would just put those two pieces there.
Yeah, I think it is a really important question. And I've been I've been teaching international development for 8 years, and then I've tried to find ways to move away from it. I ended up in sociology. I'm not even a sociologist, so that explains that. But I'm teaching human rights now, and it's very adjacent, so that didn't really solve the problem. But while I was teaching it, I guess one way to think about it is that whatever you want to study, be explicit about the purpose of your interest. And a lot of the desires that come with wanting to engage with development, they can be career, whatever, it's not a problem in and of itself. But a lot of mastery, hierarchy, racism, whatever, is reproduced within the development system. And a lot of our research questions reproduce that as well. So if you can already try and be very explicit in study anything, like, the actors that we talked about before, you can actually have a decolonial project that studies them in detail. So the research might not look very different from the outside, whatever, right? But rather than just take them at face value in the present as, turving what they do when they do it, whatever, but what would our research projects look like if you put it at the service of life versus at the service of power? I'm not even talking debt, but, there's a flip side. But so the will to life versus the will to power, I think it's about mastery, right? And so wanting to work for the UN is always a combined desire of both having an exciting job with exciting people, whatever, which is fine in and of itself. But the reason why my students would opt for the UN rather than a bank is because they do think that it is attached to positive change in the world. So if you want to commit to that, there are places where you need to think, or that you need to research, or purposes that you put into it, that it just doesn't map onto it anymore. It doesn't. And it doesn't make you a bad person if you do, so you can still decide to study or work in those places. But then you do it as field work and just study how power works, right? But be explicit about how power appears in your research. That would be, it's vague, but it would be very important. And the other one, in terms of historicizing, I would say it's important to ask yourself the question, where do I start the story of whatever I'm studying? And so when I was teaching international development as well, our general courses 101s, they would start with, I don't know, modernization theory somewhere in the 50s, as if there was nothing else before. I changed that, for instance, by having students to read first Aimé César's discourse on colonialism. You just start somewhere else, right? You don't, what does it do if in the beginning of your story, you take the time to understand where this poverty comes from, rather than just accepting it as face value and then technically wanting to study that. So I know I mix the teaching and the research, but often obviously it goes hand in hand. But yeah, that's what I would say. Thank you.
Okay, wow, this has been a very exciting and interesting conversation, and time has just flown by. We are at the end of our discussion, and I would thank both Zophia and Olivia for their time, for their thoughts, and for the fantastic work that they're doing. And I'm very looking forward to reading more from you as you write more about these topics. Okay, so
thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.